The New Mexico Territory stretched endlessly under a merciless sun. In the summer of 1885, its adobe villages and scattered farms fighting a constant battle against the harsh desert landscape. Miguel Santos worked a small plot of land 15 miles outside Santa Fe, where he grew corn, beans, and chili peppers with the stubborn determination of a man who had never known prosperity but refused to surrender to despair. At 45, Miguel was weathered by years of drought, crop failures, and the grinding poverty that seemed to follow him like his shadow. His small adobe house sat on 20 acres of marginal land, its thick walls providing blessed relief from the desert heat but little protection from the economic hardships that plagued small farmers throughout the territory. His son Carlos, 19 years old and restless with the energy of youth, worked beside him in the fields while dreaming of adventures beyond their struggling farm. Carlos had inherited his father's strong back and honest heart, but unlike Miguel, he possessed an education. The local priest had taught him to read and write in both Spanish and English, skills that opened doors to possibilities his father had never imagined. "Papa," Carlos said on that fateful morning as they checked their irrigation ditches, "Senor Martinez says there's good money to be made working for the railroad. They're pushing the line south toward El Paso, and they need men who speak both languages." Miguel straightened from his examination of the precious water flow, his back protesting after years of bent labor. "The railroad is dangerous work, mijo. Men die building those tracks through the mountains. But they pay 3 times what we make from the farm," Carlos persisted. "In 2 years, I could save enough to buy better land, maybe closer to town where the soil is more fertile." "This land has been in our family for 50 years, Miguel replied quietly. "Your grandfather cleared these fields with his bare hands. There's honor in continuing what he started." Carlos was about to respond when the sound of gunshots echoed across the valley, sharp cracks that sent desert birds flying from their perches in the sparse cottonwood trees. Both men froze, listening intently as the shots were followed by angry shouts in English. "Trouble," Miguel observed, shading his eyes to scan the horizon. "There," Carlos pointed toward the mesa that rose from the desert floor about 2 miles to the north. "I can see dust clouds like riders moving fast." The shooting continued sporadically, suggesting a chase rather than a battle. Miguel felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. The choice between minding his own business and involving himself in conflicts that were none of his concern. "We should see if anyone needs help," Carlos said. Already moving toward their horses. "Carlos, wait," Miguel called. "We don't know what kind of trouble this is. It could be bandits, could be a range war. Not our fight either way." But as they watched, 2 figures appeared on the rim of the mesa, silhouetted against the burning sky. Even at a distance, there was something unusual about their size and the way they moved. Too large to be ordinary people, too deliberate in their movements to be cattle. "Papa, look," Carlos breathed. "Those aren't normal-sized people." Miguel squinted against the desert glare and felt his heart catch in his throat. The 2 figures were indeed giants, women by their clothing and bearing, but standing nearly 7 feet tall with the powerful build of warriors. They appeared to be Dakota Indians, their long braids and traditional dress unmistakable even from a distance. As they watched, a group of perhaps 8 armed men on horseback appeared in pursuit, their shots echoing off the canyon walls. The 2 giant women were trapped on a narrow ledge with nowhere to run, and it was clear that their pursuers intended violence rather than capture. "They're going to kill them," Carlos said with quiet horror. Miguel made his decision with the speed that had kept him alive through decades of frontier hardship. "Get the wagon, mijo, and bring your rifle." "What are we going to do?" "We're going to save them," Miguel replied simply. "Those women are trapped, and those men mean murder. I won't stand by and watch innocent people butchered." Carlos stared at his father in amazement. Miguel Santos was known for his caution, his careful avoidance of trouble, his focus on minding his own business. But now the quiet farmer was loading ammunition with the efficiency of a man preparing for war. "Papa, there are 8 of them, and only 2 of us," Carlos pointed out. "And we don't even know these women." "I know they're in trouble and need help," Miguel replied. "That's enough." They reached the base of the mesa just as the shooting intensified. Miguel could see the attackers more clearly now. Rough-looking men, with the appearance of buffalo hunters or hide traders. The kind of men who killed Indians for sport and profit. "Stay with the wagon," Miguel ordered Carlos. "If things go bad, you drive back to town and get the sheriff." "I'm not leaving you," Carlos protested. Miguel looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not the boy who had worked beside him for years, but a young man capable of making his own choices about courage and honor. "Then stay low and watch our backs," Miguel said finally. "And Carlos, whatever happens here today, I'm proud to have you as my son." They climbed the rocky slope with the stealth Miguel had learned during his service in the territorial militia 20 years earlier. The 2 giant women were indeed trapped on a ledge about 50 feet above the desert floor, with their attackers positioned to prevent any escape. "Surrender, you damned savages," one of the hunters was shouting. "Come down peaceful and we'll make it quick," one of the giant women replied in accented English, her voice carrying clearly despite the distance. "We have done nothing wrong. We are traveling peacefully to our people in the south. Let us pass." "Like hell we will," another hunter laughed cruelly. "Do you know what a pair of 7-foot Indian women will bring in a traveling show? Dead or alive, you're worth a fortune to the right buyer." Miguel felt his anger burn cold and steady. These men weren't even killing for some twisted sense of justice. They were planning to capture and sell human beings like cattle. "That ends now," Miguel muttered, taking careful aim with his rifle. His first shot took the leader's hat clean off his head and sent the man diving for cover. Carlos, following his father's lead, put a bullet into the ground, right between another hunter's boots. "This is Miguel Santos," Miguel called out in English. "You men are trespassing on my land and threatening innocent travelers. Leave now or face the consequences." "Santos," the leader shouted back. "This ain't your business, farmer. These are dangerous savages who need to be dealt with." "The only dangerous savages I see are the ones shooting at unarmed women," Miguel replied. "You have 1 minute to mount up and ride out, or my son and I will start shooting to kill." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 8 armed men against 2, with the lives of the giant women hanging in the balance. Miguel could feel sweat running down his back despite the desert heat, knowing that if shooting started in earnest, he and Carlos would be badly outnumbered. But sometimes, Miguel reflected, doing the right thing mattered more than calculating the odds. "Your move, gentlemen," he called out. "Choose wisely." The leader of the hunters looked around at his men, clearly weighing their chances against 2 entrenched defenders with good positions and steady aim. After a long moment, he spat into the dust and holstered his weapon. "This ain't over, Santos," he called out. "You're protecting murderous savages, and that makes you an enemy of all decent white folk. I'm protecting innocent people from murderous cowards," Miguel replied calmly. "Now get off my land before I forget my Christian charity." As the hunters rode away, Miguel and Carlos climbed carefully up to the ledge where the 2 giant women waited. Up close, their imposing stature was even more impressive. Both women stood nearly 7 feet tall. With the muscular build of warriors and the dignified bearing of nobility, the elder of the 2, perhaps 30 years old, stepped forward and addressed Miguel in careful English. "I am Tall Bear Woman of the Dakota people. This is my sister, Standing Cloud Woman. We are in your debt, Miguel Santos." "You owe me nothing," Miguel replied, removing his hat respectfully. "I couldn't stand by and watch innocent people harmed." Standing Cloud Woman, who appeared to be in her early 20s, spoke for the first time. "You risked your life and the life of your son for strangers. This is the action of a warrior with great honor." Carlos, who had been staring at the 2 women with obvious fascination, finally found his voice. "Are you really 7 feet tall?" "Carlos!" Miguel scolded, embarrassed by his son's blunt question, but Tall Bear Woman smiled, the expression transforming her stern features. "Your son speaks truth without shame. Yes, we are blessed with great size. In our people, this is seen as a gift from the Creator, making us strong enough to protect those who need protection, like we needed protection today," Carlos observed thoughtfully. "And like you provided protection," Standing Cloud Woman added, her dark eyes meeting Carlos's with obvious interest. "You are very brave for one so young." As Miguel helped the two women down from the mesa and offered them food and rest at his farm, he had no idea that the rescue he'd just performed would set in motion events that would transform not only his own family's destiny, but the entire relationship between the Anglo and Indian communities in the New Mexico territory. His son Carlos, meanwhile, was discovering that some encounters change a person forever, and that sometimes a single moment of courage can open doors to possibilities that seemed impossible just hours before. The poor farmer had saved two giant Dakota sisters, but what he didn't yet realize was that they were about to save his family in return. That evening, as the desert sunset painted the New Mexico sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the Santos family shared their simple meal with two of the most remarkable women Carlos had ever encountered. Tall Bear Woman and Standing Cloud Woman sat with natural dignity at the rough wooden table, their impressive stature somehow fitting perfectly into the humble adobe kitchen. "You mentioned traveling south to your people," Miguel said, as they shared beans, tortillas, and green chili stew. "Are you far from home?" "Very far," Tall Bear Woman replied, her English careful but clear. "We come from the Dakota territory, from the Pine Ridge area. Our people were moved to reservations, but some families scattered to find better life elsewhere. Our father was a chief," Standing Cloud Woman added, "but when the government soldiers came, he chose to send his daughters away rather than watch them suffer on the reservation. We have been traveling for 3 months, seeking our uncle's band in the mountains of Mexico." Carlos listened intently, fascinated not just by their story, but by the quiet strength both women displayed. Despite their obvious hardships and the danger they'd faced that morning, they carried themselves with dignity and grace that commanded respect. "Why were those men hunting you?" Carlos asked. The two sisters exchanged glances, and Tall Bear Woman answered carefully, "Because we are different. Our size makes us valuable to certain white men who see us as curiosities to be displayed for money. We have been pursued by such men for weeks." Miguel felt his anger returning. "You mean they wanted to sell you to traveling shows? Like carnival attractions?" "Yes," Standing Cloud Woman confirmed. "There are men who pay much money for unusual people to display in their shows. They care nothing for our humanity, only for the profit our appearance might bring. That's barbaric," Carlos said with quiet intensity that surprised his father. "It is the world we live in," Tall Bear Woman replied philosophically. "But today we were blessed to encounter a man of honor and his brave son." As the evening progressed, Carlos found himself drawn into longer conversations with Standing Cloud Woman, discovering that beneath her imposing exterior was a sharp intelligence and gentle humor that captivated him completely. She spoke 3 languages fluently, had extensive knowledge of healing herbs and traditional medicine, and possessed a deep understanding of both Indian and white customs that came from years of traveling between both worlds. "Your son has kind eyes," Standing Cloud Woman observed to Miguel during a quiet moment. "In our culture, we believe the eyes reveal the true heart. His heart is good." Miguel watched his son with growing amazement as Carlos asked thoughtful questions about Dakota culture, listened intently to stories of their travels, and showed genuine respect for both women's experiences and opinions. This was a side of Carlos he'd never seen before, confident, engaging, and clearly smitten with possibilities he'd never previously considered. When it came time to prepare sleeping arrangements, Miguel offered the women his own bed while he and Carlos would sleep in the barn. But Tall Bear Woman politely declined. "We are accustomed to sleeping under stars," she said. "If you have blankets, we will be comfortable by your fire outside." "Absolutely not," Miguel protested. "You're guests in my home. You'll sleep inside where it's safe and comfortable." "Papa," Carlos interjected quietly, "maybe we could ask them what they prefer rather than deciding for them." Miguel looked at his son in surprise, recognizing wisdom in the suggestion. Throughout his life, Miguel had tried to help people by doing what he thought they needed. But Carlos was suggesting they might help better by respecting what their guests actually wanted. "You're right," Miguel said, turning back to the women. "What would make you most comfortable?" Standing Cloud Woman smiled at Carlos approvingly. "Your son shows great wisdom for one so young. We would be honored to sleep in your home, if you truly don't mind the inconvenience." Later that night, as Miguel and Carlos settled into the barn, the older man found himself reflecting on the day's extraordinary events. "Carlos," he said finally, "I need to ask you something important. Today, when we rescued those women, I saw something in your eyes I've never seen before. What are you thinking?" Carlos was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the stars visible through the barn's open door. When he finally spoke, his voice held a certainty that surprised his father. "Papa, I think I've been waiting my whole life for today to happen." "What do you mean?" "I mean that this morning I was just a farmer's son dreaming about railroad work and better land. But tonight I know exactly what I want to do with my life." Miguel felt his pulse quicken with apprehension. "Carlos, what are you saying?" Carlos sat up and faced his father in the starlight. "I'm saying that Standing Cloud Woman and her sister shouldn't have to travel alone through dangerous territory, constantly running from men who want to capture and exploit them. They need protection, and they need someone who understands both worlds to help them reach their destinations safely. You want to go with them?" Miguel's voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to escort them south to the Mexican mountains, help them find their uncle's people, and make sure they're safe." Carlos's voice grew stronger with each word. "And if they'll have me, I want to ask Standing Cloud Woman if she'd consider letting me court her properly." Miguel felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. His son, his only child, his partner in working the farm, his hope for carrying on the family legacy, was talking about leaving to pursue a relationship with a Dakota woman he'd met less than 12 hours earlier. "Carlos, mijo, you barely know this woman. How can you make such a life-changing decision so quickly?" "How did you know you loved Mama?" Carlos asked gently. "You've told me the story 100 times. You saw her at church one Sunday and knew immediately that she was the woman you wanted to marry." Miguel felt his heart clench at the mention of his late wife, Maria, who had died of fever 5 years earlier. Carlos was right. Miguel had indeed known instantly that Maria was the woman for him, though he'd never expected his son to use that story to justify his own impulsive romantic inclinations. "That was different," Miguel protested. "Your mother and I were from the same culture, the same community. We understood each other's worlds. But did you really understand each other's worlds before you got married?" Carlos pressed. "Or did you learn to understand each other through love and patience and commitment?" Miguel stared at his son, recognizing his own words and wisdom being reflected back at him. Carlos wasn't being impulsive. He was being brave in the same way Miguel had been brave that morning when he'd risked his life to save 2 strangers. "Carlos, even if this woman were to return your feelings, do you understand what kind of life you'd be choosing? The prejudice you'd face? The challenges of building a life between 2 very different cultures?" "Papa, I understand that it wouldn't be easy. But I also understand something else. I've spent 19 years dreaming about finding something worth dedicating my life to. Today I found it." Miguel looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not the boy who had worked obediently beside him for years, but a young man who had found his calling and was willing to fight for it. "What about the farm? What about carrying on our family's legacy here?" Carlos reached out and grasped his father's hand. "Papa, the greatest legacy you could leave me isn't this land or this farm. It's the courage you showed today when you risked everything to help people who needed protection. That's the legacy I want to carry forward," as father and son sat in the desert silence, both understanding that their lives were about to change forever. Miguel found himself remembering his own father's words from decades earlier. "Mijo, a man's greatest responsibility isn't to preserve the past, but to build a future worthy of the sacrifices that came before." Perhaps Carlos was right. Perhaps the bravest thing Miguel could do was trust his son's judgment and support his choice, even if it meant letting go of dreams they'd shared for years. "You're serious about this," Miguel said finally. "This isn't just infatuation or the excitement of adventure." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," Carlos replied firmly. "Papa, when I looked at Standing Cloud Woman today, I saw my future. Not just romance, but partnership, purpose. The chance to build something meaningful with someone extraordinary." Miguel sighed deeply, feeling the weight of fatherhood settling on his shoulders one more time. Tomorrow, he would have to let his son make a man's decision and face the consequences, whatever they might be. "Then we'll talk to them in the morning," Miguel said quietly. "We'll see what they think of your proposal, and we'll figure out how to make this work if they're agreeable." Carlos threw his arms around his father with fierce gratitude. "Thank you, Papa. I know this isn't what you expected, but I promise you, I'll make you proud." "You already have, mijo," Miguel replied, holding his son close. "You already have." As they settled down to sleep, both men knew that tomorrow would bring conversations and decisions that would reshape their family's destiny. The poor farmer who had saved 2 giant Dakota sisters was about to discover that sometimes the greatest rescues are mutual, and that love has a way of transforming everyone it touches. Dawn came gently to the New Mexico desert, painting the adobe walls of the Santos farm in soft gold and rose. Miguel woke to find that Tall Bear Woman and Standing Cloud Woman were already awake, sitting quietly by the dying embers of the cooking fire and speaking softly in their native language. Both women rose respectfully as Miguel emerged from the barn, their imposing stature and natural dignity making them appear like ancient queens holding court in his humble farmyard. "Good morning, Miguel Santos," Tall Bear Woman said formally. "We thank you for your hospitality, but we must continue our journey today. The men who hunted us yesterday may return with reinforcements." "About that," Miguel replied, feeling the weight of the conversation he was about to initiate. "My son Carlos has something he'd like to discuss with you both." Carlos appeared from the barn at that moment, having obviously taken extra care with his appearance. His hair was neatly combed, his best shirt was clean and pressed, and he carried himself with the determined bearing of a young man who had made an important decision. "Tall Bear Woman, Standing Cloud Woman," Carlos began formally, "I would like to ask your permission to speak about a matter of great importance to all of us." The 2 sisters exchanged glances, and Miguel could see that they had already sensed the direction this conversation would take. Standing Cloud Woman's expression was carefully neutral, but her dark eyes held a warmth that hadn't been there the previous evening. "You may speak," Tall Bear Woman said gravely. "We will listen with respect." Carlos took a deep breath and plunged ahead. "Yesterday, when my father and I helped you escape from those hunters, something changed for me. Not just because of the danger or the excitement, but because I met someone who showed me what I've been missing in my life." He turned to address Standing Cloud Woman directly. "I know we've only known each other for 1 day. I know our peoples have different customs, and that I have no right to presume upon your kindness. But I also know that when I looked at you yesterday, I saw my future." Standing Cloud Woman's expression didn't change, but Miguel noticed that her hands had stilled in her lap and she was giving Carlos her complete attention. "I want to ask if you would consider allowing me to accompany you on your journey south," Carlos continued. "Not just as protection, though I can offer that, but as as someone who hopes to earn the right to court you properly according to both our traditions." The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Miguel felt his heart pounding as he watched the two sisters communicate through glances and subtle expressions that spoke of years of shared understanding. Finally, Tall Bear Woman spoke. "Carlos Santos, this is a serious matter you speak of. Marriage between Dakota and Mexican peoples is not common, but it is not unknown. However, there are many things you must understand before we can consider such a proposal." "I'm willing to learn whatever I need to learn," Carlos replied immediately. "Are you willing to live among our people? To learn our language, our customs, our ways of seeing the world?" Standing Cloud Woman asked, her voice gentle but searching. "Yes," Carlos answered without hesitation. "Are you willing to face the prejudice of both our peoples? There will be Dakota who will not accept a Mexican husband, and Mexicans who will not accept a Dakota wife," Tall Bear Woman continued. "I've already thought about that," Carlos replied. "My father taught me that the opinion of prejudiced people matters less than living according to your own conscience and honor." Miguel felt a swell of pride at hearing his own teachings reflected so clearly in his son's words. Standing, Cloud Woman studied Carlos carefully. "And what of your father's farm? Your responsibilities here? Would you abandon your family's legacy for a woman you barely know?" "I wouldn't abandon it," Carlos said, glancing at his father. "I would transform it. If you'll have me, I'd want to bring you back here eventually, to build a life that honors both our traditions. This farm could become a place where Dakota and Mexican families could meet, trade, and learn from each other." Miguel stared at his son in amazement. In the space of one night, Carlos had not only decided to pursue love, but had envisioned a future that could bridge the gap between two cultures in ways Miguel had never imagined. "You have given this much thought for such a short time," Tall Bear Woman observed approvingly. "But thinking and living are different things. Standing Cloud Woman, what is your heart telling you about this young man's proposal?" All eyes turned to the younger sister, whose opinion would clearly determine the outcome of Carlos's bold request. She studied Carlos for a long moment, her dark eyes seeming to look directly into his soul. "My heart tells me that this is a man of honor who sees beyond surface appearances to recognize true worth," Standing Cloud Woman said finally. "My heart also tells me that I have been lonely on this journey, not just for safety, but for companionship with someone who might understand both the world I come from and the world I'm traveling toward." She paused, then continued with growing certainty. "Carlos Santos, if you are truly willing to learn our ways and face the challenges that would come with such a union, I would be honored to have you accompany us south. And if, during that journey, we find that our hearts are truly compatible, I would consider a formal courtship." Carlos's face broke into a grin of pure joy. "You mean it?" "You'll let me come with you?" "We mean it," Tall Bear Woman confirmed. "But understand, this is not a promise of marriage. This is an opportunity for you to prove that your intentions are serious and that you can adapt to our way of life." "I understand," Carlos replied eagerly. "When do we leave?" Miguel stepped forward, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he was about to lose his son, but proud beyond words of the man Carlos had become. "If you're going to do this," Miguel said quietly, "you need to do it right. Tall Bear Woman, what would be the proper way for Carlos to request permission to court your sister according to Dakota custom?" Tall Bear Woman smiled, clearly approving of Miguel's question. "In our tradition, a young man who wishes to court must demonstrate his worthiness through gifts and service. He must show that he can provide for a family and that he respects the woman's family." "What kind of gifts?" Carlos asked. "Horses are traditional," Standing Cloud Woman said with a slight smile. "But we understand that you are not a wealthy man. The value is not in the cost of the gift, but in the thought and effort it represents." Carlos was quiet for a moment, then his face brightened with inspiration. "I may not have horses, But I have something that might be even more valuable for a long journey." He disappeared into the house and returned carrying his most prized possession, a rifle his grandfather had given him, along with a hand-tooled leather ammunition belt and a fine knife in a decorated sheath. "These belonged to my grandfather, who was a scout for the territorial government," Carlos said formally, offering the weapons to Tall Bear Woman. "They're accurate, well-maintained, and have protected our family for 30 years. I offer them as a gift to demonstrate my serious intentions and to ensure that you have the best possible protection on your journey." Tall Bear Woman accepted the weapons with obvious respect, examining them with the eye of someone who understood their quality and significance. "These are worthy gifts," she pronounced. "They speak of your family's honor and your personal sacrifice. Standing Cloud Woman, what do you think of this gesture?" "I think it shows a man who puts others' welfare above his own possessions," Standing Cloud Woman replied. "This is the kind of man who makes a good husband." Miguel watched this formal exchange with fascination, recognizing that he was witnessing the beginning of a courtship that would bridge two very different cultures. His son was embarking on an adventure that would test every aspect of his character. But Miguel could see that Carlos had already passed the first and most important test. He had approached the situation with respect, sincerity, and genuine care for the women he was asking to trust him. "Then it's settled," Tall Bear Woman announced. "Carlos Santos will accompany us south as our protector and as a suitor for Standing Cloud Woman's hand. We will travel together, learn about each other, and see what the Great Spirit intends for our futures." As the four of them began preparing for departure, Miguel felt a complex mixture of pride, fear, and hope for his son's future. Carlos was leaving the only life he'd ever known to pursue love with a woman from a different world entirely. But as Miguel watched Carlos and Standing Cloud Woman work together to pack supplies, their easy communication and obvious mutual respect, he began to believe that perhaps his son had indeed found something extraordinary, not just love, but the chance to build bridges between worlds that had too long been separated by fear and misunderstanding. The poor farmer had saved 2 giant Dakota sisters, but now it was clear that they were about to save his son in ways that went far beyond physical rescue. 3 days later, Miguel Santos stood alone in his farmyard, watching 3 riders disappear into the southern horizon. Carlos rode between Tall Bear Woman and Standing Cloud Woman, his posture confident and his face turned toward a future that would have been unimaginable just a week earlier. The leave-taking had been emotional but hopeful. Carlos had promised to return within 6 months, either to bring his new wife home or to explain why the courtship hadn't worked out. Either way, Miguel knew his son was embarking on the adventure of a lifetime. "Take care of them, mijo," Miguel whispered to the distant figures, "and let them take care of you." As the days passed, Miguel found himself adjusting to solitude in ways he hadn't expected. The farm work was harder without Carlos's strong back and willing hands, but Miguel discovered that he wasn't as lonely as he'd feared. Word of his rescue of the Dakota sisters had spread throughout the territory, and he found himself receiving visitors from surprising quarters. Father Martinez, the local priest, stopped by to express his admiration for Miguel's courage in helping strangers regardless of their race or culture. Several neighboring farmers came to ask his advice about dealing with various problems, having gained new respect for his judgment and character. Most surprisingly, a delegation of Pueblo Indians from a nearby reservation visited to thank him formally for his kindness to their Dakota sisters. They brought gifts of pottery and woven goods, and their elder spoke of Miguel as a man who sees with his heart rather than his prejudices. But the most significant visitor came exactly 2 months after Carlos's departure. Miguel was working in his garden when he heard horses approaching and looked up to see 3 riders coming from the south. 2 unmistakably tall figures flanking a familiar young man. "Papa!" Carlos called out as they approached, his voice carrying joy and excitement across the desert air. Miguel dropped his hoe and ran toward them, his heart pounding with relief and anticipation. As they drew closer, he could see that all three were healthy and happy. But there was something different about their arrangement. Carlos rode closer to Standing Cloud Woman than before, and their body language suggested an intimacy that hadn't been there when they'd left. "Carlos, my son," Miguel embraced his boy with fierce gratitude. "You came back. Are you well? Are you all well?" "We're all very well, Papa," Carlos replied, his grin bright enough to outshine the desert sun. "And we have news." Standing Cloud Woman dismounted with fluid grace and approached Miguel with a warm smile that transformed her imposing features completely. "Miguel Santos, I want to thank you for raising such an honorable son. The past 2 months have shown me that Carlos possesses all the qualities a woman could want in a husband, and I want to thank you for teaching me the values that made it possible for Standing Cloud Woman to accept my proposal," Carlos added. His arm moving naturally around his intended's waist, Miguel felt his eyes fill with tears of joy. "You're engaged?" "We are," Tall Bear Woman confirmed, dismounting to join the conversation. "My sister and I have found our uncle's people in the mountains south of here. They welcomed Carlos as a son and gave their blessing to the union. The wedding will take place here on your farm, combining both Dakota and Mexican traditions. Here." Miguel asked in amazement. "If you'll allow it," Standing Cloud Woman said gently. "Carlos speaks constantly of his father's wisdom and kindness. I would be honored to be married in the home of such a man." Miguel looked around his modest farm with new eyes, trying to imagine it as the site of a wedding that would unite 2 cultures. "It would be my privilege to host such a celebration." "But how?" "I mean, the preparations, the guests, already arranged," Carlos laughed. "Papa, you won't believe how many people want to attend this wedding. The Pueblo elders, the priest, half the farmers in the territory, and about 50 Dakota relatives who are traveling up from Mexico. This is going to be the event of the decade. Over the following weeks, the Santos farm was transformed into a center of activity as preparations for the wedding began in earnest. Miguel found himself working alongside Dakota women who taught him traditional foods and customs, while Carlos learned to weave elements of Mexican Catholic ceremony into Dakota spiritual practices. The wedding itself, held on a perfect October day, was unlike anything the New Mexico territory had ever witnessed. More than 200 people gathered in the desert around the small adobe house, representing a dozen different tribes and communities. The ceremony was conducted in 3 languages, with blessings from both a Catholic priest and a Dakota medicine man. Standing Cloud Woman wore a wedding dress that combined the best of both traditions. White satin in the Mexican style, decorated with intricate Dakota beadwork that told the story of her family's history. Carlos wore a traditional Mexican wedding suit enhanced with Dakota accessories gifted by his new in-laws. But the most moving moment came when Father Martinez asked Miguel to speak about the couple during the ceremony. 3 months ago, Miguel said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. I rescued 2 women from men who saw them only as curiosities to be exploited. Today, I'm gaining a daughter who sees my son as the man he truly is, honorable, brave, and worthy of love. This wedding isn't just the union of 2 people, but proof that when we look past surface differences to recognize each other's humanity, we create something beautiful that enriches all our lives. As Carlos and Standing Cloud Woman exchanged rings and vows, Miguel reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with a simple decision to help strangers in danger. His act of courage had revealed his son's capacity for love that transcended cultural boundaries, and that love was now creating bridges between communities that had rarely interacted peacefully. The celebration that followed the ceremony lasted 3 days, with Dakota drums mixing with Mexican guitars, traditional foods from both cultures shared at long tables. and children from different backgrounds playing together while their parents discovered they had more in common than they'd ever imagined. On the final evening, as the last guests were preparing to depart, Tall Bear Woman approached Miguel with a proposal that left him speechless. "Miguel Santos," she said formally, "my people have been discussing your farm and its location. It sits on traditional trading routes between our communities and could become a permanent meeting place for cultural exchange. Would you consider allowing us to help you expand it into a trading post and cultural center?" Miguel stared at her in amazement. "You want to turn my farm into a trading post?" "Not just a trading post," Carlos interjected, his eyes bright with excitement. "Papa, imagine a place where Dakota families traveling south could stop safely, where Mexican farmers could learn Dakota techniques for desert agriculture, where children from both cultures could play and learn together." Standing Cloud Woman took her husband's hand as she added, "We've seen how much good came from one act of kindness. Imagine how much good could come from creating a permanent place where kindness and understanding could flourish." Miguel looked around at his modest farm, trying to envision the transformation they were proposing. "It would require a lot of work, a lot of changes, and a lot of help," Tall Bear Woman assured him. "My uncle's band has agreed to send craftsmen to help build proper facilities. The Pueblo communities want to contribute materials and labor. Even Father Martinez has offered to help establish a school that would serve children from all our communities." "You've already discussed this with all these people?" Miguel asked, overwhelmed by the scope of their vision. "We've discussed it with everyone who's seen the beauty of what happened here this weekend," Carlos replied. "Papa, you saved 2 women from hunters, and that act of courage created something that's brought together hundreds of people in peace and celebration. People want to be part of making that permanent." Miguel walked to the edge of his property and looked out at the desert landscape that had been his world for so many years. The idea of transforming his isolated farm into a hub of cultural exchange was both thrilling and terrifying. "What would happen to my crops, my farming?" he asked practically. "You'd still farm," Standing Cloud Woman assured him. "But you'd also have help, and you'd be growing food, not just for survival, but to feed travelers and guests. The trading post would make you prosperous in ways you've never imagined. More importantly," Carlos added, "you'd be doing what you were meant to do, helping people, bringing communities together, creating something meaningful that will last long after we're all gone." Miguel turned back to face the 3 people who had become the center of his world. His son, his new daughter-in-law, and the woman whose rescue had started this entire adventure. "You really think this could work?" he asked. "I think you've already proven it can work," Tall Bear Woman replied. 3 months ago, strangers helped strangers because it was the right thing to do. Today, those strangers have become family, and that family has brought together communities that had been separated by fear and misunderstanding." Miguel nodded slowly, feeling the rightness of their proposal settling into his bones like certainty. "Then let's do it. Let's build something that honors what we've learned about the power of kindness and understanding." The cheers that erupted from the gathered crowd, Dakota, Pueblo, Mexican and Anglo families who had witnessed this conversation, seemed to echo across the desert and up to the stars themselves.